There it is, one of the most infamously hard NES games to ever be released.
You know, it's funny, when I looked up information for this video about this game, I learned that this game originally came out on the Famicom Disk System a year before it came out on the NES in the United States. Just a neat tidbit of information. Now I wonder how much of this game was removed in order to fit in the cartridge, and how different of a game that version is. But anyway, on to the version of the game that I'm talking about today.
Castlevania was released in 1987, and it was Konami's attempt at releasing a more adult and mature video game for the NES, and this was done by having the game based around horror elements. Another part of this game's legacy that I've already spoken about in the intro is that it is indeed considered one of the hardest NES games. And with that all out of the way, let's jump into this analysis of the first Castlevania game.
To start off with, Konami has seemed to have gone for a movie presentation for this game, such as with the film reels on the top and bottom of the screen, and the intro cutscene being like the intro to a movie. This is more prominent in the ending, with it being acting like a credits to the end of a movie, as well as the later sequels. But it's a neat little thing that they done. Alright, let's move on to the story, which follows Simon Belmont as he continues the cursed legacy of his family's name to defeat Dracula every time he resurrects. And that's basically it, for now at least. Next, we move on to the gameplay itself, which, to start off with, this game is an action platformer, which was quite common at the time. But unlike something like Mega Man or Contra, since the time period of this game is in the 18th century or so, you aren't using guns to defeat Dracula's minions. You are using a whip and a supply of items that you would never think to use as weapons, such as holy water, a stopwatch, a cross, and, well, a knife, but you'd expect to use that. Each one having its own advantages and disadvantages, like the holy water basically makes a fire effect that stays for a few seconds, while the cross is able to basically boomerang while hitting multiple enemies or objects. And the ammunition used for these items for some reason are hearts, so you need to collect a lot of them and be able to use them. And you can get power-ups that allows you to use more than one. I think it goes up to 4, but that's really uncommon to see. Your other weapon, the whip, which you'll be using for majority of the game, since it doesn't take anything to use. It's about as good as you can get. It can be upgraded twice, and you'll basically be using the upgraded version for most of the game, since it's virtually impossible not to get the upgrades, but also that the regular whip isn't very good, and the second one doesn't have the range. There are other small items, but they're mainly, well, to be blunt, useless and just for points, like the screen clearing cross, or the water that makes you invincible for a few seconds, and then everything else, like the money or the crowns, I guess, are just they aren't really useful. They get you, if you get a certain amount of points, you get an extra life, but not really that worth it. Finally, we have what the game uses for health instead of the hearts, and it's food that's hidden within the walls. And this piece of food is aptly named the pork chop, despite looking more like a turkey. But regardless of those oddities, this health item can really help you when you're nearly dead. Now we have how the game actually feels while playing, which is very stiff. This is because of two reasons. One is when you jump,
you are stuck within that jump. Like, you are not able to move while you are jumping. You are just dedicated to it. So you want to make sure that you're ready to make that jump before doing it, or else you will screw yourself up. The second reason is because the whip as well as the items take a second to attack due to them having a wind-up animation. So you have to think ahead on when you want to use these in order to properly attack the enemy without getting hit. And of course, the game's stiff gameplay factors into its infamous difficulty, but more on that later. Alright, let's knock out two more things before getting into the meat of this. And those are going to be the music and the graphics. Starting with the graphics, they are very detailed with the sprites for the monsters that are used in the game. And I would say that this is probably one of the best looking NES games on the console, even if the main character didn't get as much love, as he doesn't have a face. Next we have the music, which I'll say is really good, action-packed, and perfectly fits alongside the gameplay, but I can't really say that I would think of it as horror music. I mean, they tried to mix the horror and action aspects within the music, but I think the action took it over a bit too much, but I would still say it's pretty good. I would say the best piece of horror music in this game is the final boss theme, but even then I would call that more suspenseful than horror. Now we are moving on to the big stuff, such as the stages, enemies, and bosses. And we will also take a look at the difficulty to see if it's truly deserving of its infamous status. Alright, starting with the stages, I have neglected to say where this game takes place so far, which is in Dracula's castle, which means each stage involves you going up the castle to get to the top, where Dracula is located. And the stages are, for the most part, very straightforward. Very rarely are there branching paths, and there's not that many secret locations to get to. Then we have the enemies and bosses, which are based off of famous classic horror villains such as, well, Dracula himself, obviously, Frankenstein, Medusa makes an appearance, and as well as the creature from the Black Lagoon. And they will all have unique attack patterns that you will have to learn and memorize in order to properly deal with each and every one of them. Such as Medusa heads that fly in a wave pattern across the screen, skeletons with a never-ending supply of bones to throw at you, and hunchbacks that will just keep on jumping around. The same is true for the bosses, with mummies shooting cloth at you and the Grim Reaper spawning in a bunch of scythes to go after you. Now we finally move on to the difficulty itself. To start off with, yes, I would consider this game to be overall pretty difficult, and there is a good challenge to be had here, but that's for majority of the game, and I would say that only about 20% of it is truly as hard as this game's reputation perceives. But before I get into that, here are the reasons that this game isn't as easy as it could have been. The first and probably most annoying thing on this list is the knockback when you are hit, as you will be pushed back a few inches, and although on its own you are not gonna die from it, you can die, however, if it's happening right next to a pit, because you will fall down it and lose a life. The second reason is because the enemies and bosses just simply do a whole lot of damage to you and can take you down in just 3 to 4 hits usually. The third reason isn't as big as the other two, but it still is as annoying as them, which is getting stuck on the stairs, because you can accidentally get yourself onto the stairs by pressing the wrong buttons and then being stuck on them if you get hit for a few seconds and then just continuously getting hit. But again, it doesn't happen as often as the other two. And finally, we have what happens when you die and what happens when you get a game over. To start off with dying, I have to first explain how this game works with its stages. That is because there are multiple sections within each stage, and every time you die, you get pushed back to the last section that you have entered. Not too bad, all things considered, since these sections aren't really that long. and it helps you memorize it. Then we have what happens when you lose all your lives, which is get a game over, which will result in you having to go back to the beginning of the stage itself. This is very fair when considering that on the NES, there were games that if you got a game over, you would have to start the whole thing over again. And with that all explained, I will now move on to what I believe to be the 3 hardest parts in this game. First is the 1-2 punch of the hallway before the Grim Reaper, and then the Grim Reaper boss fight itself. In this hallway, you have to deal with 2 knights, and the knights have a whole lot of health, and they can throw axes at you either above or below, while also having to deal with Medusa heads. This part can be very painful, but there is a sort of rhythm that I managed to figure out to it. Basically, every time a Medusa head comes, you jump over it, and you would have to attack right as you're about to get into the, like, sort of space that if the knight were to throw an axe and the top, you would have to attack as soon as you get to that area. Then you would basically have to wail on him until the next Medusa head comes, and then you would have to keep repeating that process until the knight is dead. And as mentioned, immediately after this hallway, you have to fight the Grim Reaper, meaning that if you got hit during the hallway, that's how much health you have during this boss fight. Now for this boss fight, the Grim Reaper himself is not the most scariest part, it's the scythes that he could spawn in. Since he can make 3 appear at a time, and they all come in at random areas on the screen. Not to mention that he has no limit on spawning them, so if you aren't destroying them, you could have up to like 9 of them on the screen at once. But staying on that note, basically what you want to do to beat him is throw the crosses to take out the scythes, then attack him when you have an opening. This strategy is even better if you are lucky enough to get a power-up that allows you to throw multiple crosses, since you would be able to basically spam them all over the screen and not give his scythes like a chance at all. Finally, we move on to arguably the hardest part of the game, the final boss, aka Dracula himself. Now before even fighting him, you have to basically stock up on a bunch of hearts because you're gonna need them by going up and down the stairs and destroying the candles. When you are fully stocked up and ready to go, it is finally time to face off against this blood-sucking blight and vanquish him from this world. But he won't go down that easy. He will appear and disappear randomly on the stage, and you have to be ready for him. You can only do damage to his head, and he will shoot out fireballs from his torso. The best strategy here is to play it patiently. Wait for Dracula to spawn in, get yourself into attacking position, wait for him to shoot out the fireballs, which is preceded by him opening up his cape, and once the fireballs are taken out, attack his head. But you have to do this all pretty quickly before he disappears again. This is the reason that you need a bunch of hearts. It's because the game gives you the cross again, and like the Grim Reaper boss battle, you need to basically use it to get rid of the fireballs or to attack him. Anyway, after you manage to knock Dracula's block off, he turns into a giant monster. Don't remember him doing that in the movies. But regardless of that, I'll be perfectly honest, this second phase of his is a complete crapshoot. To start off with, there's no healing item between the 2 phases, so if you got hit during the first phase, you're just stuck with what you have. He will shoot fireballs from his mouth this time, and he will jump around. Now, while it's easy to get rid of the fireballs, when he jumps, you have to be like right next to him when he does it and moving as soon as he does it, or else you're gonna get hit, and if you get hit 4 times, it's over. You gotta do the whole thing over again. It really is pixel-perfect bullshit to avoid his jump. But other than that, the strategy basically stays the same. Just attack him a bunch of times with the crosses mainly. Hit him with the whip when you can. And once you defeat him as this, congratulations, you completed Castlevania. That is until the credits end and the game drops you right back at the beginning in a New Game Plus. Now, supposedly New Game Plus is much harder than the main game, but I wouldn't know that since I've never played it. But that ultimately doesn't matter since I'm not going to be factoring it into the difficulty as a whole, since it's more of a bonus mode. And that is more or less everything I have to say about Castlevania. And now that the review is complete, there are 2 questions left to answer. The first question is, would I still consider this to be one of the hardest NES games? And after all the evidence that I have put forward, I would say no. The simple fact of the matter is that this game isn't as hard as people would lead you to believe, and the few parts that are actually hard can be eventually learnt and dealt with because of the lenient game over system. And the second question is a more general, is this a good game even all these years later? And the answer to that is yes. This is still a fun and challenging game to come back to, and a strong start for the Castlevania series. And in the end, it truly wasn't as hard as we thought it was. Is it me or is this castle flipping me off? Like, that's clearly what it looks like, right?